In this video, we'll create and edit a sketch. After completing this step, you'll be able to create a sketch, apply sketch dimension, apply a sketch constraint, and use a center point rectangle. In Fusion 360, we're going to start with a new untitled document. The first thing that I want to do is expand the document settings inside of the browser, and note that the default units is millimeters. For this example, I'm going to change the units to inch, select OK, and then minimize the document settings in the browser. Now that our units are set to inch in this new untitled document, we want to start by understanding how to create a sketch. We're going to begin by going to the Create menu and selecting Create Sketch. There are multiple ways that we can start a new sketch, but all sketches are going to require either a plane or a planar face on your design. For this example, we're going to be using the default planes, and in my case, I'm going to select the YZ plane, which is also known as the right plane. Once we start a sketch, you'll notice that a grid appears, and it's showing us a green and red center line, as well as the origin. It's also brought up the sketch palette on the right-hand side. There are various tools inside of the sketch palette, and as we begin sketching, more options will appear. But let's take a quick look at what's available to us. We can change the line type to a center line or a construction line. We can use Look At, which will allow us to view a plane or planar face in a normal orientation. We can turn on or off our sketch grid. We can turn on or off snapping to the grid points. We can turn a slice option on, which will be more apparent once we have some solid geometry. We can show profiles, points, dimensions, constraints, projected geometry, and again, these will all become more apparent as we begin to have more complicated examples. And lastly, we can toggle on and off the ability to create a 3D sketch. Even though we started by selecting a plane, we can sketch in 3D with any of our sketches. But for right now, let's leave that option off. To get started, I want to begin by taking a look at the Create menu and looking at some of the sketch entities we can draw. We have lines, various types of rectangles, circles, arcs, polygon, an ellipse, a couple different kinds of slots, and a few different types of splines. In addition, we can also create what's called a conic curve. These options will all be extremely helpful depending on what types of designs you work on. But for our first example, let's use the line tool. For our line tool, I'm going to start at the origin by left-clicking to place my first point. Then I can drag out to specify my next point. Notice that as I get closer to horizontal, it begins to snap to that orientation. You'll also notice that roughly around the 2 mark on the axis that an icon has appeared. This is a horizontal or vertical constraint icon. Fusion 360 will automatically try to apply this for you if you get close to a snap orientation. You can override this by holding down the Control or the Command key. That'll allow you to place the line or the endpoints wherever you want. For our example, I'm going to allow it to apply that, and I'm going to put the endpoint close to about 2.5. Another thing that I do want to mention is that we have a highlighted dimension on the screen. Without placing or clicking to place that endpoint, we can manually enter a value of 2.5, and notice that now there is a lock icon. I can drag the line around, but I can't change its length. I can hit Tab and I can go to the angle measurement, which is 180 degrees right now. And for example, I could enter a value of 45. This is going to place it in the first quadrant for us. If I want to be in the third quadrant or another quadrant, I simply need to enter an angle value from the positive X direction. So notice that with those two entered, we now have a lock symbol next to both lines. If I left click, it'll place that and it will allow me to continue to begin creating our lines. Notice again that it's snapping to certain orientations. It's placing a perpendicular constraint in that corner. Because we want to learn and understand how to place dimensions and constraints, I'm going to begin just creating lines by dragging these over, and I'm going to avoid snapping to locations where we actually have constraints. and we'll work our way back to the origin point. As soon as we do, it automatically creates a blue shaded region inside of my closed profile. Notice that I'm still on the line tool, so I'm going to hit escape on the keyboard to get off of my line tool. Now, the first line we created has a dimension, and it also has an angle that's been applied. These allow it to be fully defined, so you'll notice that the line is black. The rest of the lines, however, are blue because they are free to move about. So if we want to fully dimension them, we need to begin to create some dimensions or constraints to fully define them in 3D. You'll also notice that there is a dashed horizontal line as seen by this horizontal icon. This dashed line, its length is underdefined, but it's there because of our angle dimension that we applied. So let's take a look at applying some constraints to bring this back into a fully defined sketch. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the perpendicular constraint. I'm going to apply a perpendicular constraint between this line and my fully defined line. I'm going to continue to apply those to each of the other sections. Now you can see that we've got 3 of the lines that are black and 1 that's still blue. I'm going to hit escape to get off of my constraint tool and note that this line can still move, but the other ones are fixed based on their orientations. If I want to fully define this without any more dimensions, I can use the equal constraint to make one of these perpendicular lines equal in length to my 2.5-inch line. I can hit escape to get off my constraint tool, and now I have a fully defined sketch. We can modify these at any time by double-clicking on these values, and for example, making it a 3-inch length. We can also modify the angle, for example, making this 180 degrees. Just because we have these dimensions and we have a fully defined sketch doesn't mean that we can't modify them to our needs. Now that we understand how to make a basic sketch, let's take a look at the rectangle options. Once we select rectangle, notice that we have a 2-point rectangle, a 3-point rectangle, and a center rectangle. These have different applications based on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make a square or a rectangle at an angle, as we did originally, then you'd want to use the 3-point rectangle option. For us, however, I'm going to use the center rectangle. I'm going to snap to the corner point that's above the origin, and I'm going to begin dragging this out. Notice that, again, we have the highlighted dimensions. If I were to just left-click without applying those dimensions, my entire rectangle is completely underdefined, with the exception of its center point, which we clicked on an existing point. I'm going to hit escape to get off my rectangle tool, and I want to take a look at applying some dimensions. From the create dropdown, we have a sketch dimension option. I'm going to select sketch dimension, and I'm going to place a vertical dimension of 2.5 inches and hit enter. My dimension tool is still active, so I'm going to dimension the horizontal line at 3.5 inches and hit enter. Now, this rectangle is fully defined based on all the constraints that are automatically applied when we sketched it, plus the 2 dimensions that we gave it. I'm going to hit escape to get off my dimension tool, and now I'm going to modify the original 3-inch dimension, and I'm going to make this 2 inches. Notice that because my new rectangle was placed at a geometry point, anytime I modify these dimensions, for example, take it to 2.5 inches, or if I modify this angle to 45 degrees, notice that all of my sketch elements move around. If I change it to 135 degrees to put it back in that original quadrant, notice that this rectangle is moving around based on that point. However, its orientation is staying based on its own constraints for being horizontal, perpendicular, and parallel. So there are many different ways that we can create these sketches, and through practice, you'll begin to understand what some of the implications of creating these sketch elements are going to be. For right now, however, let's finish this sketch. Let's bring it back into the middle of the screen, and let's save the design. It's automatically going to go into my Intro to 3D Modeling and to my Intro subfolder, but if yours is not listed here, make sure that you use this drop-down arrow and navigate to the location of your project. I'm going to call this Intro to Sketching, and we're going to be using it in another video, so make sure that you do save your work before moving on.